Hey guys, welcome to Franklin Woodworks. This is kind of a follow-up video to my last video where I made risers for my lathe. I needed the risers so I could turn a bowl much larger than the 12.5 inches my lathe was limited to. So I made risers that increased my lathe's capacity to 20 inches. Now I'm going to make a segmented bowl that will be around 16 inches wide and around 9 inches deep on the inside. And while I'm going to show you how I go about making such a thing, this isn't so much about how I turn a bowl like that, especially since I'm pretty much a novice at turning, but to highlight some of the methods I use to create something like that from scratch, and to prove my lathe risers work. I'm starting off by milling up some walnut. I have a board that is bowed and twisted, so I have to get it straight. To do this without losing too much wood in the process, I'll start by cutting the board in half. This reduces the amount of wood I'll have to take off at the joiner to get a straight edge. Then I cut the two halves in half again. I guess I should have done this before the joiner, but I don't like using the joiner with boards that are really short. It's one of those things that you have to find a happy medium that you're comfortable with, weighing the amount of wood you'll have to take off against the comfort of having a long, stable reference while you're joining. Anyway, once those pieces are cut in half, I go over to the table saw to cut the boards in half lengthwise in preparation for the joiner again. I wouldn't normally do that, but the boards were wider than the capacity of my joiner. So I joint one face of the boards, which will give me a flat reference face for the planer. Just to be on the safe side, I mark the jointed face so I don't get anything mixed up. Over to the planer where I ensure that all the boards not only have parallel faces, but are the exact same thickness. Then back over to the table saw to cut the boards in half lengthwise yet again, which will be the final dimension I'll use to cut my segments. Now if you're thinking this is a lot of work, you're right, but with segments, you can do the work before the glue up or do it after. Either way it has to be done. Using my super safe, super simple wedgie sled, I cut out all of my segments. I went online to find a calculator to determine the sizes my segments needed to be for each ring of the bowl. Then I used my gluing jig to glue the rings together. I had to create a sanding wheel for the large rings, but this really made sanding the rings a breeze, and I'll have it for future use, so it was well worth the time. Back to the gluing jig to put all the rings together. I used Titebond 3 for the glue, not only for the waterproof qualities of the glue, but for the longer open time. And those cheap chip brushes from Harbor Freight, the ones with the synthetic bristles, are really nice for spreading glue on things like this. For the bottom of the bowl, I pre-turned a piece of solid walnut, so after the glue dried on the rings, I had to get creative on gluing the base on. So now it's time to turn this thing. I'm going to breeze through this part since I'm a novice, and you won't learn very much from me. But one thing about turning something that's really close to the capacity of the lathe is that I had to take the bowl off the lathe to move the banjo from the top of the bowl to the side. And if there's one tip I can give you, take the chuck off of the lathe to do this. Don't take the bowl off the chuck. It will never center exactly like it was, and you'll end up taking off more wood to true it up again. Oh, and another thing to consider, the advantage of gluing all your rings together before you get started turning is that it's easy to do, and it's easier to keep things centered. The disadvantage is that it's hard to get down to the bottom of the bowl to do the turning. That is much easier to do by turning the inside of the rings as you glue them together one by one. This will take a ton more time, but you may get a better result. One thing I didn't mention before is that one of the rings was way too big to fit on my gluing jig. So after I got the outside shaped and the inside of the bowl pretty much finished, I trued up the edge, removed the bowl from the lathe, and glued on the final ring. My camera was acting up, but this will give you an idea of how I did that. Back on the lathe, a little more turning, which I didn't film because my camera was dead, and a lot of sanding. which I wasn't going to film anyway. For the finish, I made my own Danish oil with equal parts high-gloss polyurethane, boiled linseed oil, and mineral spirits. I gave the bowl 2 really heavy coats about 20 minutes apart to make sure the oil really penetrated into the wood. After that cured for 24 hours, it's time to start sanding again. After another nice thick coat of oil, I wet sand the entire bowl with 600 grit wet or dry sandpaper. The video was sped up, but I did this at the slowest speed on my lathe. That way it doesn't sling oil everywhere. I wipe off the excess and let it dry for about 8 hours. I repeat this process next with 1,000 grit sandpaper, then again with 2,000 grit sandpaper. This gives me a glassy finish and creates a depth to the finish that is just unbelievable. To complete the finishing process, I'll thin my oil mixture by adding a little more mineral spirits and give it 3 thin coats of oil, waiting 24 hours in between coats. Now all I have to do is part off the base. This is a step I didn't entirely think through, but aside from a little gouging on my chuck, I guess it turned out okay. And just a little touch-up work on the base, and this thing is ready to go. Well, I'm pretty proud of the bowl, but that's really not the point of this video. I made risers for my lathe which increased the capacity by almost 8 inches, and it worked. I didn't see any decrease in the performance or precision of the lathe. I can just turn bigger stuff. Of course, the horsepower is still the same, so I have to take that into account. But anything that comes close to the capacity of the lathe will most likely be segmented and not be a solid chunk of wood. Well, I hope this will encourage some of you to think outside the box when it comes to your tools. Don't compromise safety, but try to think of ways to make do with the tools that you have. Hope this gives you some good ideas for your shop. Thanks for watching, and there you go.